The room was small, windowless, and stifling, illuminated only by the harsh glare of fluorescent lights that buzzed incessantly, mocking the silence. 5 participants sat in a tense circle: an ex-convict named Marcus, a struggling single mother named Rachel, a college dropout named Ethan, a war veteran named Greg, and a mysterious man who only referred to himself as Doctor. Each wore identical white scrubs, stripped of any individuality, as if to erase who they were before stepping into this chamber of nightmares. The experiment was simple on paper but sadistic in execution: no sleep for 15 days. Scientists, hidden behind a two-way mirror, monitored every breath, every twitch. Cameras in every corner captured the participants' raw humanity, their unraveling psyche. A voice crackled through the intercom, cold and clinical: "You are here to test the limits of human endurance. No sleeping. No resting. Food will be provided at regular intervals. Fail to comply, and you'll be penalized." Marcus laughed nervously, leaning back in his chair. "What are they gonna do? Slap us on the wrist?" Doctor's hollow gaze met his. "You'll wish they did." Day 1 began without fanfare. The 5 were given bland, nutritionally balanced meals and access to a small bathroom, but otherwise confined to the room. Conversation was stilted, each person gauging the others, trying to read their intentions. Rachel clutched a locket hidden beneath her scrubs, a lifeline to the daughter she'd left behind for the promise of financial reward. Ethan fidgeted constantly, tapping his fingers against the metal table in an erratic rhythm that grated on everyone's nerves. Greg sat stoically, his military training keeping his emotions in check. Marcus, however, prowled the room like a caged animal, his bravado masking the fear that shimmered just beneath. By evening, fatigue began to gnaw at their edges. The room's oppressive heat combined with the relentless hum of the lights made even breathing an exhausting task. Doctor stared at the mirror, unblinking, as if daring the scientists to break him. When the lights suddenly dimmed at midnight, the voice returned. "This is your first test. The room will fill with a mild sedative gas. Fight the urge to sleep, or face the consequences." The air grew thick with a cloying sweetness. Greg immediately began pacing, forcing his muscles to move. "Stay active," he barked, his tone commanding. Marcus cursed under his breath, slapping his face repeatedly to stay awake. Rachel tried counting backwards from 1,000. Her voice trembling with each number. Ethan collapsed to the floor, struggling to stand. Doctor, however, simply stared at the mirror, his lips moving silently as if in prayer. His eyes betrayed no fear. Rachel faltered first. Her body slumped against the wall, her eyes fluttering shut. An alarm blared, piercing the room like a dagger. From behind the mirror, a hatch opened, and a drone glided in, its mechanical arms tipped with needles. Rachel woke too late to react as it injected her neck with something cold and burning. She screamed, writhing on the floor as the veins on her arms turned black, the chemical racing through her bloodstream. The pain was indescribable, her shrieks echoing long after the drone retreated. "This is a reminder," the voice said. "Sleep is not permitted." Rachel curled into a ball, tears streaming down her face. No one dared to comfort her. By the morning of day 2, the 5 looked haggard, their eyes bloodshot, their movements sluggish. The voice announced their next task: solve a complex puzzle within an hour, as sleep deprivation gnawed at their minds. Failure would result in corrective measures. The puzzle was a series of interlocking cubes, their surfaces covered in jagged edges that sliced their fingers, the flesh beneath raw and pulsing. The others could only watch, their horror a mirror of their own impending fate. By the dawn of the 3rd day, the air in the room felt heavy with dread and exhaustion. The fluorescent lights buzzed incessantly, a maddening drone that scratched at the edges of sanity. Bloodstains smeared the walls and floor, remnants of the punishment from the day before. Marcus sat slumped in a corner, his hands trembling, his fingers now grotesque, raw stumps wrapped in improvised bandages made from torn scraps of his scrubs. Greg lay unconscious but alive, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. Rachel rocked back and forth, her bloodshot eyes fixed on her locket. Ethan and Doctor exchanged wary glances, their faces pale and drawn. The intercom crackled to life. "Welcome to day 3, the voice said, clinical as ever. Your next task will test your ability to work together. The punishment for failure will not be shared, it will be selective. One of you will suffer for the mistakes of the group." The room fell silent. A cold tension thickened the air as they awaited further instructions. A panel slid open in the wall, revealing 5 crude iron collars with wires dangling from their sides. "You will wear these devices. They are connected to a circuit. You must complete the maze on the table within 30 minutes. If you fail, the one among you deemed the weakest link will experience an electric shock, increasing in intensity until the maze is solved." The maze was deceptively simple in appearance, a glass structure with an intricate web of paths and dead ends. They hesitated, staring at the collars, each one knowing they had no choice. Greg groaned awake as Marcus hissed, "We need to do this fast. No screw-ups this time." The collars locked around their necks with a metallic click, the wires snaking out like veins of a living thing. The timer began counting down on a screen above the mirror. Ethan took the shaky hands guiding a small metal ball through the maze. Rachel hovered over him, offering directions, her voice shrill with panic. Marcus barked orders, his tone sharp and venomous, while Greg struggled to keep his balance, leaning heavily on the table. Doctor, as always, stood back, observing. "You're rushing," he said coolly, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You're making mistakes." Ethan glared at him, sweat dripping down his face. "Then help, you bastard." The timer hit the 15-minute mark, and a warning beep echoed through the room. Rachel's hands shook as she tried to assist, but her trembling knocked the ball into a dead end. The alarm blared, and suddenly, Marcus screamed. His body jerked violently as electricity coursed through him. The smell of burning flesh filled the air as the current surged, lighting up his collar. His screams were primal, echoing off the walls and reverberating in their chests. "Fix it." Marcus shrieked, his voice raw and broken. "God damn it, fix it." The others scrambled, their panic doubling with every second. Rachel cried openly, her tears falling onto the maze as her fingers fumbled with the ball. Greg's hands were too unsteady to be of any use. Ethan cursed under his breath, his eyes darting between the maze and Marcus, who convulsed with every failed attempt. When the timer finally stopped, the maze was only half finished. Marcus collapsed to the floor, smoke rising faintly from his collar. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and brimming with hatred. "We failed," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. "You failed," Marcus rasped, his voice a guttural snarl. "And I paid for it." Day 4 began with an ominous silence. The voice over the intercom didn't come immediately. The group sat in a strained, oppressive quiet, each afraid to move or speak. Marcus's body twitched involuntarily, remnants of the previous day's torture still coursing through him. Greg's breathing was skin-pale and slick with sweat. Rachel stared blankly at the wall, murmuring incoherently to herself. Only Doctor seemed composed, though his expression had grown colder, harder. The intercom crackled after what felt like an eternity. "Day 4 will test your physical endurance. Each of you will participate. The punishment for failure will be irreversible." Before anyone could ask what that meant, the floor opened beneath them, revealing a pit lined with jagged spikes. A narrow beam extended across it, just wide enough to stand on. Above the beam dangled ropes, each tied to a weight too heavy to lift easily. "You will cross the beam while carrying the rope in your teeth," the voice instructed. "If you fall, you will not survive. If the weight drops, the spikes will rise." Rachel sobbed openly, shaking her head. I can't do this." "Then you'll die," Marcus spat, his voice venomous. "And honestly, maybe that's mercy." One by one, they were forced to attempt the task. Greg went first, his military training granting him some semblance of balance. though his weak condition made each step agonizing. The weight dragged his head down, the rope cutting into his gums. Blood dripped down his chin, but he made it to the other side, collapsing in a heap. Rachel was next. She hesitated, trembling, until Marcus shoved her toward the beam. "Move!" he growled. She stepped onto the beam, her sobs turning into hiccuping gasps as she shuffled forward. Halfway across, the weight slipped from her teeth, and the spikes shot upward. She screamed as the sharp metal tore into her legs, the pain unbearable. The others could only watch as the mechanism pulled her back onto the beam, the spikes receding, leaving her bloodied and whimpering. Ethan and Marcus followed, each barely making it across. Marcus stumbled at the last moment, his hands flailing, but he caught himself, spitting curses as he reached safety. Ethan's face was pale, his lips stained red. When it was Doctor's turn, he walked the beam with unnerving ease. The weight seemed to pose no challenge for him, his steps calculated and steady. He made it across without so much as a falter, his cold gaze sweeping over the others as if to say, "You're all beneath me." By the end of the fourth day, the group was broken. Bloodied, bruised, and terrified, they sat in silence, each lost in their own private hell. The experiment was only a third of the way through, but it already felt like an eternity. And they all knew, deep in their hearts, that the worst was yet to come. Day 5 began with a cruel silence that was broken by the familiar static of the intercom. By now, the group was beyond exhaustion. None of them had managed to sleep for even a second since the experiment began. Bloodshot eyes, trembling hands, and the hollow look of despair were etched into their faces. Rachel sat in a corner, clutching her mangled leg, her lips moving in silent prayer. Marcus paced with a limp, his movements jerky and aggressive. Greg was barely conscious, his head lolling forward, his breath rattling. Ethan stared at the floor, unmoving, his mind a void. Doctor stood as he always did, watching, waiting. "Good morning," the cold voice greeted them. "Today's task will challenge your control and resilience under extreme conditions. You will each receive a live rat strapped to your body. The rat will be placed in a metal cage secured tightly against your abdomen. To prevent the rat from burrowing into your flesh, you must remain still and silent for 30 minutes. If you move or scream, the rat will be agitated and encouraged to dig deeper." A slot in the wall opened, revealing 5 small cages, each containing a frenzied rat. The animals clawed and bit at the bars, their sharp teeth glinting in the harsh light. The group recoiled in horror. Marcus cursed under his breath, his face pale. Rachel began to sob, clutching at Ethan's arm, but he pulled away, his own terror rendering him incapable of comfort. 2 men in black suits entered the room, their faces emotionless. Without a word, they began strapping the cages to the participants' abdomens. The cold metal pressed against their bare skin, and the rats screeched and clawed, desperate for escape. Marcus thrashed against his captors, spitting profanities, but a sharp blow to his temple silenced him. Rachel whimpered, tears streaming down her face as the cage was secured to her trembling body. The timer started. At first, there was silence, save for the frantic scratching of the rats. The participants held their breaths, their bodies tense, their eyes wide with terror. Then the rats began to move. Their claws scraping against skin, their noses twitching as they sniffed for a way out. The pressure was unbearable, the sensation of tiny feet scuttling over their flesh enough to drive them mad. Rachel broke first. A muffled scream escaped her lips as the rat bit into her side, its teeth sinking deep into her flesh. The cage vibrated as the rat clawed and chewed, its frenzied movements spurred on by her cries. Blood seeped through the bars, staining her clothes and pooling beneath her. "Stay still." Marcus hissed through gritted teeth, his own body trembling as his rat began to dig. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms, drawing blood, but he refused to move. Ethan bit down on his lip until it bled, his eyes squeezed shut as he felt the sharp pain of claws raking across his stomach. Greg slumped against the wall, his body twitching involuntarily. The rat in his cage grew more aggressive, sensing weakness. It clawed at him with renewed vigor, its teeth scraping against bone. Doctor didn't flinch. His expression remained eerily calm, even as blood dripped from the bottom of his cage. The rat inside his enclosure seemed almost subdued, as if it recognized the futility of its struggle. When the timer finally stopped, the cages were removed. Rachel collapsed into a sobbing heap, her hands clutching her torn flesh. Marcus leaned against the wall, his breath ragged, his face pale. Greg didn't move, his body a bloody mess. Ethan staggered to the corner and vomited, his entire frame shaking. Doctor stood silently, his bloodied abdomen a testament to his resolve. Day 6 arrived, and with it came an even more sadistic task. The intercom crackled to life as the participants sat in a grim silence, their bodies broken and their minds shattered. Today's task is one of endurance, the voice announced. Each of you will be suspended by your wrists over a pool of acid. The chains holding you up are connected to weights. You must use your feet to hold the weights aloft. Should you fail, the chains will lower you into the acid. A mechanism lowered from the ceiling, revealing 5 sets of chains and harnesses. The pool of acid bubbled ominously beneath them, releasing a noxious smell that burned their nostrils. The participants were strapped into the harnesses and hoisted into the air, their wrists bound tightly above their heads. Below them, heavy iron weights dangled, connected to their chains by thin wires. Begin, the voice commanded. The pain was immediate. Their wrists burned from the strain of holding their bodies aloft, and their legs shook as they struggled to keep the weights from pulling the chains downward. The acid hissed and popped below them, sending up plumes of acrid steam that stung their eyes and throats. Greg was the first to falter. His legs gave out, and the weight pulled his chain downward. The acid licked at his toes, and he screamed as his flesh sizzled and dissolved. The smell of burning meat filled the room, and the others gagged, their horror giving way to panic. Hold on. Marcus shouted, his voice hoarse. Don't you dare give up. But Greg couldn't. His strength was gone, his body too weak to resist. The chain lowered him inch by agonizing inch into. The remaining 4 were dragged, barely resisting, into separate, coffin-like chambers. The walls were lined with speakers, wires running like veins into the darkness above. As the doors sealed shut, the lights within the chambers turned a sterile white, the kind that hurt their eyes even before the torture began. The noise erupted without warning, a symphony of chaos. High-pitched screams, screeching metal, guttural roars, and overlapping whispers bombarded their senses. It wasn't just loud, it was disorienting, maddening, and seemed to drill directly into their skulls. Rachel clawed at her ears, her broken nails tearing at her skin. Blood smeared her cheeks as she screamed, though her voice was swallowed by the sound. Her breath came in rapid, shallow gasps, her chest heaving as she tried and failed to stay calm. When the first warning splash of icy water hit her feet, she froze, her sobs replaced by trembling compliance. Marcus slammed his head against the walls of his chamber, the noise merging with the cacophony. His guttural screams turned into hoarse, animalistic growls as he writhed against the straps securing him. The sound of a baby crying echoed in his chamber, its pitch rising until it felt like knives were being driven into his brain. Tears streamed down his face, unbidden and unrelenting. Ethan sat motionless, his eyes wide, his mind fracturing under the relentless assault. The whispers in his chamber called his name, spoke of his deepest fears, hissed secrets he didn't remember telling anyone. His body convulsed as he fought the urge to tear at his ears. The water began to rise, but he didn't notice until it reached his knees, its icy grip shocking him back to reality. Doctor remained still, though his muscles twitched with tension. The sound seemed to target him directly, voices of the past, of people he had wronged or abandoned, filling the chamber with accusations and screams. He closed his eyes, his breathing, but his fingers dug into his thighs, leaving crescent-shaped welts. When the 6 hours ended, the doors opened, and they were dragged back into the central room. Rachel had to be carried, her body limp and unresponsive. Marcus stumbled forward, his fists clenched, his face contorted in rage and despair. Ethan collapsed onto the floor, shivering, while Doctor simply stood there, his expression unreadable. The 8th day arrived with a grim sense of inevitability. The intercom crackled to life once more. Today's task will test your loyalty to one another, the voice said, its detached tone as chilling as ever. In front of you are 4 syringes filled with a neurotoxin. Each of you must inject one person. The toxin will paralyze the body but leave the mind intact, allowing the subject to feel everything that happens to them for the next 24 hours. If no one is injected within the hour, all of you will receive a double dose. A table rose from the floor, the syringes neatly arranged in a row. The group stared at them, their faces pale, their bodies trembling. Rachel, still barely conscious, whimpered and tried to crawl away, but Marcus grabbed her arm, his grip firm. "We have to do it," he said, his voice shaking. "If we don't, we all die." "No," Ethan rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "There has to be another way." The 8th day began with an unrelenting sense of dread. None of them had truly slept, even in their moments of exhaustion-induced blackouts. Rachel's paralyzed body lay limp in the corner, her eyes still moving, filled with silent agony. The air was thick with unspoken tension, and the participants avoided each other's gazes. The intercom crackled to life. "Your task today will be to explore the limits of human pain tolerance. In the center of the room, you'll find a machine. This device is designed to extract one of your teeth without anesthesia. The process will last no less than 3 minutes per extraction, ensuring maximum safety. Each of you must lose one tooth by the end of the hour. Refusal will result in the extraction of all teeth for every participant." The floor shifted as a steel contraption emerged, gleaming under the harsh light. A clamp attached to a mechanism stood at the center, its purpose chillingly clear. Next to it, a set of pliers lay waiting, stained with rust and dried blood, as though they had been used before. Marcus swore under his breath, pacing the room. "This is insane." It's not about what we've done," Doctor interrupted, his voice cold and calculated. "It's about what we're still willing to do. We have no choice." Ethan, trembling, stepped forward. "Fine. I'll go first. Let's just get it over with." The others watched in silence as Ethan positioned himself in the chair. His hands trembled as he guided the clamp over one of his molars. The machine whirred to life, its low hum a sinister prelude to the horror about to unfold. The clamp tightened. Ethan's scream echoed through the chamber as the machine began its slow, torturous extraction. The tooth didn't simply pull free, it twisted, tore, and resisted every inch of the way. Blood dripped down his chin, pooling on the floor. The others flinched, their own teeth aching in phantom sympathy. By the time the tooth was fully removed, Ethan was sobbing, clutching his bleeding mouth as he stumbled back into the corner. Marcus was next. His attempts to mask his fear failed as he gritted his teeth and sat down. The process repeated, every second dragging on like an eternity. His muffled screams turned into guttural roars of pain as the tooth was pried from his jaw, blood splattering across his chest. Doctor took his turn with an unnerving calmness, though his jaw clenched tightly as the machine worked. His silence was somehow more unnerving than the screams of the others. When it was Rachel's turn, the others hesitated. She couldn't move, couldn't protest, but her eyes spoke volumes. "We have to," Marcus said, his voice cracking. Together, they held her head in place as the machine descended on her. Rachel's muffled cries filled the room as the clamp did its cruel work. By the time it was over, her face was a mask of blood and tears, her once defiant spirit shattered. The intercom crackled again. "Well done. Pain reveals the soul's true strength. Prepare yourselves for tomorrow, when you'll face a challenge of endurance unlike any other." That night, the group sat in silence, their bodies racked with pain, their minds teetering on the edge of collapse. Rachel's silent suffering became the soundtrack of their torment. The 9th day began with a foreboding quiet. The intercom's voice returned, monotone yet brimming with malice. "Today's task is one of endurance. Each of you will be suspended by your wrists in the air for 6 hours. Beneath you will be spikes designed to pierce the skin should you lose your strength. Those who fall will not die immediately but will suffer until the task is complete. Remember, your lives are yours to preserve. Chains descended from the ceiling, ending in cruel, rusted cuffs. Beneath them, spikes gleamed with a deadly sheen. The group hesitated, but the chains began to move, locking onto their wrists. Each of them was hoisted into the air, their weight pulling painfully at their arms. Within minutes, the pain set in. Their shoulders burned as the cuffs dug into their wrists, the metal biting into their flesh. Marcus was the first to cry out, his muscles straining as he tried to hold himself steady. Ethan's grip faltered, and he dropped a few inches, the spikes grazing his feet. Blood trickled down his toes, and he screamed, thrashing against the chains. Doctor gritted his teeth, his face contorted in pain. He refused to let go, though his body trembled with the effort. His calculated demeanor began to crack, revealing the desperation. Bill's limp body hung motionless, her wrists bloodied from the chains. Her eyes stared blankly ahead, the fight drained from her. As the hours dragged on, Marcus finally fell. The spikes pierced his calves, and his scream was a guttural, primal wail. He tried to pull himself up, but his strength failed him. Blood pooled beneath him as he writhed, his pain fueling the horror of the others. Ethan followed soon after, his legs impaled by the spikes. His sobs turned into broken laughter, the sound echoing eerily in the chamber. Doctor held on until the very end, his face pale, his breath shallow. When the chains finally released them, the survivors collapsed onto the floor, their bodies broken. Their minds shattered. The intercom crackled one final time for the day. Remarkable. You've proven the resilience of the human spirit. Rest well, for tomorrow will bring a challenge that will test your very humanity. There was no rest. Only the ever-present sound of Rachel's ragged breathing, Marcus's muttered curses, and Ethan's broken laughter, echoing like a ghost of what they once were. The 10th day dawned with a silence that felt more oppressive than the previous day's screams. No one spoke, the room reeked of blood, sweat, and despair. Ethan sat in a corner, rocking back and forth, his eyes vacant. Marcus lay curled on the floor, his body twitching as he muttered incoherently. Doctor kept his focus on Rachel, whose shallow breaths made the room feel heavier. They were all prisoners of their own bodies, on the brink of collapse, but the intercom didn't care. It crackled to life, delivering its latest decree: today's task will test your capacity for sacrifice. You will decide who among you shall endure physical mutilation for the survival of the group. A surgical kit has been provided. One participant must lose a finger every hour. Failure to comply will result in all participants losing both hands via remote detonation of the cuffs you wear. The chains around their wrists tightened slightly, a cruel reminder of the threat. A metal tray descended from the ceiling, holding a grim assortment of tools, a scalpel, bone saw, pliers, and clamps. They stared at it in silence, the full horror of the task sinking in. Doctor was the first to speak. We can't argue. We'll take turns. His voice was cold, devoid of emotion, as if detachment was the only way to survive. Ethan let out a guttural laugh. Take turns? That's rich. Let's start with Rachel. She's dead weight anyway. Marcus lunged at Ethan, pinning him against the wall. Shut up. You don't get to decide that. Doctor pulled them apart with surprising strength. Enough. We don't have time for this. He grabbed the scalpel and turned to Rachel. She can't feel anything. It's logical to start with her. The others didn't argue. Doctor placed Rachel's limp hand on the tray and secured it with clamps. With a precision that bordered on mechanical, he made the first incision. Blood flowed freely as he worked the scalpel around the base of her finger. The sound of the bone saw grinding through her joint filled the room, a grotesque symphony of survival. The hour passed, and Marcus was next. He gritted his teeth as Doctor sliced through his finger. Tears streamed down his face, but he refused to scream, his pride holding steady even as pain consumed him. When it was Ethan's turn, he thrashed violently, forcing Doctor and Marcus to hold him down. His screams were deafening as the scalpel bit into his flesh, his curses reverberating off the walls. By the end of the task, the group was drenched in blood, their minds fractured by the relentless horror. The intercom's voice returned, monotone and unfeeling, "You've proven your willingness to endure for the group. Tomorrow, you will face the true meaning of loyalty." The night offered no reprieve. Ethan whimpered in his sleep, his mutilated hand twitching. Marcus stared at the ceiling, whispering prayers that went unanswered. Doctor sat by Rachel, wiping the blood from her face as if it would make a difference. On the 11th day, the intercom greeted them with its customary lack of empathy. "Today's task is a test of trust. Before you is a table with 5 glasses of water. 4 are laced with a paralytic toxin that will render you unable to move for 12 hours. 1 glass is safe. You must decide who drinks which glass. Refusal to participate will result in dehydration until one of you dies." The tray appeared, each glass identical, their contents clear and inviting. The room felt even smaller, the walls pressing in as the group exchanged wary glances. "We'll draw straws," Doctor said, his voice firm. Ethan laughed again, a bitter, humorless sound. "Straws? You think luck's going to save us?" Marcus grabbed a glass without hesitation. "Screw it. I'm not waiting around to die." He drank deeply, his face contorting as he slammed the empty glass. Ethan followed suit, grabbing a glass and downing it in one go. "Let's see if fate has a sense of humor." Doctor hesitated before choosing his glass. He sniffed it, as if he could discern the poison by scent, but there was no telling. With a resigned sigh, he drank. That left Rachel. Doctor placed the last glass to her lips, tipping it gently. Her eyes darted around wildly, the only indication of her terror. Minutes passed, then an hour. Marcus's body went rigid first, collapsing to the floor with a thud. Ethan followed, his limbs locking in place as he fell, his breathing shallow. Doctor grunted as the toxin took hold, his body slumping against the wall. Rachel, already immobile, showed no visible change, but her panicked eyes revealed her agony. The intercom crackled once more. "Congratulations. One of you drank the safe glass. To the rest, enjoy your temporary respite. Remember, stillness is the cousin of death." The room fell silent, save for the labored breathing of the paralyzed participants. Time stretched endlessly, each second dragging into an eternity. As the hours passed, the paralytic began to wear off, leaving them weak and trembling. The realization that the experiment was far from over weighed heavily on their broken minds. They were trapped in a nightmare with no escape, each day pushing them closer to the edge of sanity. The 12th day began with a deep silence that felt heavier than the collective dread in the room. The participants were shadows of their former selves, gaunt, trembling, and driven to the brink of madness. Ethan sat with his back against the wall, his mutilated hand twitching uncontrollably. Marcus's breathing was shallow, his cracked lips moving in silent prayers. Doctor leaned over Rachel, checking her pulse out of habit rather than hope. None of them had slept in nearly 2 weeks, their minds unraveling as the lack of rest ate away at their sanity. The intercom's familiar crackle cut through the oppressive day began with a deep silence that felt heavier than the collective dread in the room. The participants were shadows of their former selves, gaunt, trembling, and driven to the brink of madness. Ethan sat with his back against the wall, his mutilated hand twitching uncontrollably. Marcus's breathing was shallow, his cracked lips moving in silent prayers. Doctor leaned over Rachel, checking her pulse out of habit rather than hope. None of them had slept in nearly 2 weeks, their minds unraveling as the lack of rest ate away at their sanity. The intercom's familiar crackle cut through the oppressive silence. "Good morning, subjects. Today's task is a study in resilience and pain tolerance. A series of devices have been provided, each designed to inflict escalating pain. The task is simple: endure the devices for as long as possible. The one who lasts the least amount of time in each round will face an additional penalty of my choosing. There are 5 rounds. Complete them all, or everyone dies." A mechanical whir signaled the descent of a steel tray from the ceiling. On it lay the instruments of torment, a clamp with serrated edges, a cattle prod, a razor-lined glove, a weighted needle that would pierce through the flesh if dropped, and a set of electrodes hooked to a generator. Doctor inhaled sharply. They're pushing us to destroy each other. Don't let them win. Ethan barked a laugh, his voice manic. Win? There's no winning here. Let's get it over with. The first device was the clamp. Marcus volunteered to go first, placing his hand into the serrated edges. The machine tightened automatically, grinding into his flesh. Blood seeped out as he clenched his teeth, his muffled screams filling the room. He lasted a minute before yanking his hand free, leaving a trail of shredded skin. Ethan sneered, shoving Marcus aside. Pathetic. He thrust his hand into the clamp, enduring the tightening grip. He lasted 2 minutes before his skin began to tear, forcing him to retreat with a string of curses. Doctor went next, his face a mask of determination. He lasted 3 minutes, pulling his hand out just as the metal threatened to sever a finger. Rachel, still unable to act on her own, was forced into the device by Doctor. Her lack of response allowed the machine to keep tightening until her bones cracked, a sickening sound that made Marcus vomit in the corner. The cattle prod was next. Marcus gritted his teeth as the electrified rod pressed against his skin, the high-pitched buzz mingling with the smell of burning flesh. He managed 15 seconds before collapsing. Ethan followed, screaming as his muscles spasmed uncontrollably under the shocks. Doctor lasted the longest, his stoic expression faltering only slightly as the prod seared his skin. By the third round, with the razor-lined glove, the group was visibly shaking. Marcus barely managed to slide his hand into the glove before collapsing from blood loss. Ethan fared slightly better, clenching his jaw as the razors cut deep into his fingers. Doctor, still holding on to some semblance of control, endured the task with a grim focus, guiding Rachel's unresponsive hand through the motions with sickening precision. The weighted needle proved to be the breaking point for Marcus. When it was his turn, the needle pierced straight through his palm. And he screamed so loudly his voice gave out. Ethan spat blood but endured, while Doctor, once again, had to complete Rachel's turn as the group watched helplessly. By the time they reached the electrodes, the group was barely coherent. The generator hummed ominously as Marcus collapsed almost instantly under the shocks. Ethan followed suit after 15 seconds, his body convulsing violently. Doctor endured long enough to secure the win but was visibly weakened, his hands trembling as he disconnected the electrodes from Rachel. The intercom buzzed. Congratulations. You've all survived, except Marcus, who failed in 3 rounds. His penalty will be immediate. Marcus barely had time to scream as the floor opened beneath him, chains pulling his limbs taut as a metal arm descended, holding a branding iron. The searing hiss of flesh burning filled the room as Marcus's screams grew faint, his body twitching violently before going still. The 13th day began with the survivors staring at the charred remains of Marcus, their minds too fractured to fully process the horror. The intercom's voice was almost cheerful. Today's task is simple. You will each be locked in a sensory deprivation chamber for 12 hours. The chambers are soundproof, pitch black, and filled with ice-cold water. Failure to remain submerged for the duration will result in electrocution. You must endure. The chambers appeared from hidden compartments in the walls, each resembling a metal coffin. Doctor guided Rachel into one before stepping into his own. Ethan hesitated, his eyes darting around wildly. This is insane. This isn't survival, this is death. Get in, Doctor growled, his voice colder than the water awaiting them. The lid slammed shut, plunging them into darkness. The icy water swallowed their bodies, leaving only their faces above the surface. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional drip of water. Time lost meaning in the oppressive void. Ethan panicked first. The isolation clawed at his mind, his screams echoing in the chamber as he thrashed, triggering the electric currents. His muffled cries of agony faded as the shocks rendered him unconscious. Doctor focused on his breathing, his medical training the only thing keeping him anchored. He imagined the ticking of a clock, counting the seconds as his body shivered violently. Rachel remained eerily calm, her lack of movement a grin. When the chambers finally opened, Ethan was barely alive, his body convulsing as foam bubbled at his lips. Doctor crawled out, his limbs numb and useless. Rachel was dragged out by the automated arms, her unblinking eyes staring at nothing. The intercom buzzed again. 2 days remain. Prepare yourselves for the final phase. The group lay in silence, their bodies and minds irreparably broken, haunted by the knowledge that the worst was yet to come. The 14th day arrived with an oppressive stillness. Dr. Ethan and Rachel lay motionless in the room, their bodies wrecked from the endless torment. Marcus's charred remains had been removed, leaving only the faint smell of burnt flesh to remind them of his fate. No one spoke, their gazes locked on the intercom, dreading the next command. The voice finally crackled through, distorted, almost playful. Good morning, subjects. We are nearing the end. Today's task will test your commitment to the experiment. Before you are 3 syringes. Each contains a unique compound. One will induce temporary paralysis. The second will flood your system with extreme pain, akin to the feeling of being burned alive. The third will cause severe hallucinations for the next 24 hours. Each of you must inject one. You will not know which is which. A tray descended from the ceiling, holding 3 syringes filled with colorless liquid. Doctor leaned against the wall. His expression blank. Ethan trembled, his lips cracked as he muttered incoherent curses. Rachel sat eerily still, her face a hollow mask of nothingness. Doctor moved first, his hand unsteady as he picked a syringe. It's random, he murmured, as if convincing himself. Without hesitation, he plunged the needle into his arm and pressed the plunger. Ethan followed, his body shaking uncontrollably. This is insane, he muttered, tears streaking his gaunt face. He selected the middle syringe and jabbed it into his neck, his movement. Doctor turned to Rachel, who hadn't moved. He sighed and injected the final syringe into her arm, her unresponsiveness unnervingly consistent. Within moments, the effects began. Doctor's body went rigid, his muscles locking as he collapsed to the floor, unable to move or even blink. Ethan screamed, clawing at his skin as waves of searing, phantom heat engulfed him. His screams turned guttural, his fingernails tearing into his flesh as he tried to escape the imaginary flames. Rachel remained seated, but her vacant stare slowly shifted, her pupils dilating as she began to twitch. She clutched at her head, her lips moving soundlessly as invisible horrors invaded her mind. For hours. The room was filled with Ethan's agonized cries and Rachel's frantic muttering. Doctor lay silent, his frozen form a stark contrast to the chaos. When the effects finally wore off, the survivors were unrecognizable. Ethan's body was covered in self-inflicted wounds, his breathing shallow. Rachel's fingernails were broken and bloodied from scratching at the floor, her eyes darting wildly as she whispered to unseen specters. Doctor, though physically unharmed, lay in a heap, his mind fragmented from hours of helpless immobility. The intercom buzzed again. Congratulations. You have survived. Tomorrow is the final day. Rest well. If you can. The 15th day began in total darkness. The overhead lights failed to turn on, plunging the room into an abyss. The intercom's voice, calm and deliberate, pierced the silence. Final task. Only one of you may leave this experiment alive. The tools you need to secure your survival are provided. A single beam of light illuminated the center of the room, revealing a table holding a knife, a garrote wire, and a hammer. The implication was clear. Doctor struggled to his feet, his legs trembling. We don't have to do this, he rasped, his voice barely audible. We can fight them. Ethan's laugh was sharp and manic. Fight them? He lunged for the knife, his desperation overriding any remnants of humanity. Doctor tackled him, the 2 men collapsing in a heap. Ethan swung wildly, the blade slashing Doctor's arm. Blood sprayed across the floor as Doctor retaliated, punching Ethan in the face with what little strength he had left. Rachel stood apart, her head tilted as if listening to something only she could hear. Slowly, she reached for the garrote wire, her movements robotic. She approached the struggling men and looped the wire around Ethan's neck, pulling with a strength that belied her fragile frame. Ethan thrashed, his hands clawing at the wire as it bit into his flesh. His gurgled screams filled the room before his body went limp. Collapsing in a heap, Doctor stumbled back, his chest heaving as he stared at Rachel. "You didn't have to." Before he could finish, she lunged at him with the knife, her expression blank but her eyes wild. The two struggled, Doctor's injured arm leaving him at a disadvantage. Rachel drove the knife into his abdomen, twisting it with precision. He gasped, blood bubbling from his lips as he collapsed. Rachel stood alone, her blood-soaked hands trembling. The intercom buzzed one final time. "Congratulations, Subject 5. You have proven your will to survive. Your reward awaits." The door to the room creaked open, revealing a long corridor bathed in sterile white light. Rachel stumbled forward, her steps unsteady. As she crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind her. The intercom spoke again, but this time, it wasn't to her. "Experiment 27, complete. Prepare the next subjects." Rachel's blood-curdling scream echoed through the corridor as she realized the truth. Her survival was just the beginning.